Welcome to Nature's Guardians. I'm Micah Siegel. Each week, I talk with people working to save and help animals around the world. They are nature's guardians, and you can become one too. Today, I'm talking with Peter Lindsey, director of the Lion Recovery Fund. Okay, Peter, where are you? And can you show us around?
So I'm in Harare, which is the capital city of Zimbabwe. So I'm just in my house, a little office in my house. So this is the back garden. We're lucky in Zimbabwe, we tend to have quite big gardens with lots of bird life. And you also get some quite cool rodents, these big Gambian pouched rats. So they're not like a vermin species, but they eat the plant matter. So they're quite cool to have in the garden. And then
Yeah, it looks very nice. To start, tell me about your background and how you got where you are now.
Okay, well, I was always interested in wildlife as a kid, and then biology was my favorite subject at school. So I took it as a degree, and then after that I did a master's degree and then a PhD, doing wildlife research all along the way. I got my first job in the bush. And then, I just had a succession of different jobs that were related to wildlife and conservation.
What did you study for your PhD?
Yeah, so going back to my bachelor's, I did a little study on jackals, which is animal a little bit like a coyote in the States. Then for my master's, I did a study on aardvarks. I don't know if you know what they are. They eat ants. And then for my PhD, I did a study on African wild dogs.
Tell us about the Lion Recovery Fund.
Yeah, so lions are struggling in parts of Africa. Their numbers have declined by about half over the last 25 years. So if you think about the release of the first Lion King movie and the second Lion King movie, their numbers declined by about half during that time. So recognizing that, the organization that I work for here, Wildlife Conservation Network, which is based in San Francisco in the US, established something called the Lion Recovery Fund. And the way it works is that we raise money from the general public, and then 100% of every dollar that is given to us, we then give to the best projects that are doing conservation work involving lions in the field in Africa.
How many lions are there and where do they live?
We don't know the exact numbers, but in Africa, there's probably somewhere between 20 and 25,000. I think 23,000 is probably the best estimate that Tanzania's got the highest number of lions, and then after that I would say it's Botswana and then South Africa, and then countries like Zimbabwe and Kenya have good numbers, and then there are quite a few in places like Zambia and Mozambique, and there's a few in Ethiopia, and then in the other countries their numbers tend to be lower.
What specific problems are you solving?
So there's a number of threats that lions face. In short, they face threats that affect their habitats, so the destruction of the woodlands and savannas in which they live. For example, when people open land up for agriculture or for human settlement. And then there are some threats that result in the death of lions themselves. Like, for example, if angry livestock farmers shoot lions to protect their livestock, or sometimes some people poach lions for their body parts to sell into the illegal wildlife trade. So we try and tackle all of those suite of problems.
Some of these problems are bigger than others. So which are the big ones?
Probably the most common threat is people hunting the animals that lions depend upon for meat. And so, because if the prey animals disappear or reduce in number, then lion numbers tend to decline very quickly. So that's a really big problem. Another really big problem is livestock keepers shooting lions to protect their livestock. So I would say those are the two big issues. But of course, habitat destruction is the ultimate threat, because when you lose the habitat, then you can no longer conserve lions. So they're all an issue, but the relative severity of each threat depends on the area in question.
Give us some examples of projects you've done and that were effective.
Yeah, so there's been a number of different projects. So we support a number of projects around Africa that work with livestock farmers that live near parks and reserves that have lions. And what you do is those projects tend to hire local people from the communities that have livestock. And then those local people help the livestock farmers build corrals to put their cattle in at night. So so that they're safe from lions, and then and help improve the way the livestock are herded so that they're less vulnerable to being attacked by lions. And then if people don't lose livestock to lions, they're much less likely to kill them. And then there are lots of projects that involve like anti-poaching in parks, so to try and catch people who are hunting illegally, or to try and remove the snares, because poachers will often put these wire traps to catch animals. So the very simple noose, they tie some wire to a tree that has a big noose like this, and then if an animal walks through it, it like pulls onto its neck, and then the animal pulls tight until it suffocates. So we hire rangers or help pay for rangers to go and remove those snares so that they don't kill any wildlife or catch any lions.
How do zoos get their lions?
Well, I mean, originally they would have caught them from the wild, but there's a lot of lions in captivity in, for example, the US now, and so I would have thought the vast majority of lions are bred within the zoo system. So yeah, I think the days of catching lions from the wild to feed the zoo industry are pretty long gone, I would have thought.
Are you concerned about genetic diversity for lions?
Yeah, absolutely. So for example, there's two subspecies of lions. There's the northern subspecies, which occurs in West and Central Africa and along the Sahel. And then there's the other subspecies, which occurs in Southern and Eastern Africa. And the lions, particularly in West Africa, are struggling, and their numbers are very low. And so if we were to lose them, we would lose a big part of the genetic diversity that the lions have. And then more generally, where in a given protected area where lion numbers decline to very low levels, there's always a risk that they might become inbred. So yeah, that's a problem. So yeah, that's something we have to manage and try and avoid.
I heard about tree climbing lions. Where do they live?
So lions can climb trees in anywhere, but they do tend to do it in some parks more than others. So for example, in Queen Elizabeth National Park in Uganda, they climb trees pretty often. In Tarangire and Lake Manyara in Tanzania, they also climb trees pretty often as well. But they do tend to they can climb trees anywhere. Normally to avoid biting flies or to get a cool breeze or something like that. But lions they're not great climbers if you compare them to, for example, leopards, which can kind of climb effortlessly. Lions are fairly lumbering when they're in trees, so they're not great climbers.
What's their favorite food?
I'd say their favorite food is kind of medium to large herbivore. So I would say the ideal size range is like a zebra or a wildebeest. They do eat bigger animals like buffaloes pretty often, and even small elephants, and also much smaller animals. But I would say their target prey range most often is kind of zebra size.
Describe for us one of the best projects that you've funded.
Yeah, so there's a project in Mozambique, for example. It's called the Mozambique Wildlife Alliance, and they do really good work at if there are problem lions like eating cattle, they catch them and move them to safe places. Or if there are lions caught in traps or snares, they catch them and treat them. Or if there are people manufacturing tools for poaching, they work with the local authorities and tackle that. So they're doing some really fantastic work. Another organization that we support a lot is called African Parks, that are managing or working with governments to help manage protected areas around Africa. So they're protecting a huge area of land in the Central African Republic, for example, and that's allowing lion numbers to increase very rapidly. And yeah, there are lots of other projects. As I said, those kind of projects that work with livestock keepers. So for example, there's one called Cope Lion in Tanzania, or African People and Wildlife in Tanzania, or Lion Landscapes in Kenya and Tanzania, or Flores Conservancy in Botswana, or Wild Crew in Zimbabwe or Botswana. They all do really good work. So we have lots of good projects, and yeah, I can't mention them all, but yeah, lots of them.
What's the difference for you between the private reserves and public parks?
By far the biggest proportion of the parks and reserves that lions occur in are public or state owned, and so they are much more important really for lion conservation than the private areas. But having said that, because private reserves tend to be very well resourced, some of the private reserves in which lions occur can have a lot of lions. So for example, some of the conservancies in Zimbabwe have got hundreds of lions in them, which is a big contribution to conservation of lions in the country.
Tourists really like to see lions. What are you doing to make sure lions are where the tourists are?
So the way we kind of stratify our investments is to make sure that we make some investments in the real strongholds of where there are really big populations of lions, and those tend to be the areas where there's lots of tourists. So for example, the Serengeti and the Masai Mara in Kenya and Tanzania have got lots of tourists and lots of lions. So we make sure we put some money into those landscapes and others like them to make sure that the lions are protected, because those parks are really important in terms of tourism and generating money for the countries that host those parks. But then we also invest money in much more remote landscapes where there's no tourism as well, because those lions are important too.
Who poaches lions and why?
Two types of poaching of lions. So one is I would call it incidental poaching, where they are caught in traps and snares that are set for other animals. So poachers who are hunting animals for meat will often try and catch antelopes or buffaloes, and then sometimes lions get caught by accident in the traps and snares that are set for those animals. And then sometimes people also poach lions specifically for their body parts. The demand for that, some of it seems to come from Asia. There seems to be a big demand for lion body parts in parts of Asia. But then there are also some local demand for lion body parts related to kind of local cultural practices and medicine. But yeah, normally it's done by kind of local people, but often being incentivized by people from outside of the continent.
Do you work with groups in Asia that are trying to reduce demand?
No, we haven't yet, but I think we need to start looking into that.
What hasn't worked and what have you learned from those failures?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say the projects that haven't worked have normally been where because we fund NGOs, right, non-governmental organizations. And the times where a project hasn't worked is if the relationship between the NGO and the government is not very strong, or it's not strong enough, and if there's like a relationship breakdown between the NGO and the government. So there's been a couple of cases where that's been a problem. So we got to make really sure that the permissions that the NGO has to work in the area are really solid, and that their relationship with the host government is really solid. So I would say that's a good example.
So your goal is to double the number of lions in the next 30 years. How do you see that happening?
It's a good question. So the best way would be to support the management of the protected areas and conservancies in which lions occur, because Africa set aside a really massive area of land for parks and reserves, but many of the African countries don't have enough funding to manage these areas properly. And so if we can support the management of those areas, then we can help reduce poaching and other threats, and that will enable lion numbers to increase. We estimate if the protected areas where lions occur were optimally managed, they could protect 3 or 4 times the number of lions that currently occur there. So that's a big deal. One thing I could say about lions is that they are what we call the flagship species. So they're very charismatic and popular. So we use them to raise money that we invest in landscapes, and then it helps to protect all wildlife, not just lions. And the other thing is they're also what we call like an indicator species or an umbrella species, so that if you protect an area so that it can support lions, then you have to have good habitat, you have to have lots of prey. And it means that if it can support lions, it can generally support pretty much everything else as well. So we use lions as a flagship to raise money to protect savanna landscapes, to protect all the wildlife that occurs there, and not just lions. So it's not just about lions.
What about the laws and regulations for lions?
Yes, I would say two things. One is, in some countries, the issue of, say, poaching of wildlife for meat is not taken seriously enough, and I think that could be strengthened in some countries. And then conversely, I think there's an opportunity to create laws that make it easier for local people to take on wildlife as a land use, so to form conservancies on community lands so that local people can form conservancies and then become the primary beneficiaries of tourism or what other land uses may occur there. And I think if we could do that, we will help to increase the area in which lions can coexist with people. So I think that's something that could be done.
So what do you need most to accomplish your goals?
Simply put, it's financial support. So, we're a fund. As I said, we try and raise funding from as many different sources as we can. Every little bit counts. And as I said earlier, we take 100%. So if someone donates $10 or $10,000 or $100,000, we'll take all of that funding and give it to the best projects in the field. So it's a very efficient way of getting funding to the field. I think last year we raised about $6 million, and it would be nice to get that up to 10 as a good sort of medium-term next level barrier to break through, and then it would be good to keep growing that. Realistically, if we could raise $100 million, we could invest it effectively, and it would make an enormous difference. So any increment on top of what we've been raising to date will make a significant difference for lions. So it's a real opportunity. If any of the listeners out there want to help, then please join us by backing us to conserve lions and the landscapes in which they occur.
Are lion numbers on their way down or up?
It's a very good question. So I would say it really depends upon the area. So in some places they're increasing, some places they're stable, and some places they're declining. I would say overall they're probably still declining, and I would expect them to continue to decline for some time. Just because we're going through a phase of a lot of pressure, because human populations are growing, the continent's developing, there's a lot of external pressure on African natural resources, etc. So there's a lot of pressure facing wildlife in Africa, but there are many reasons to be optimistic, and I think at some stage I think the decline will stop, and then eventually I think we can start to turn things around. So there's a lot of work to be done, but there are reasons for optimism. So it's important not to lose hope. And there's an incredible amount of wildlife and wild areas left in Africa, and some amazing landscapes. So there's just so much to still protect. Still decline. It may still decline for the next sort of 20 or 30 years. A net decline, but with some increases in some areas. And then I would say after that, we could potentially get it to start increasing. But it's guesswork. It really depends on all sorts of factors.
Sounds like we need to help you get $100 million right away.
So I'll give you guys a call in a month or so and see if you've raised 100 million. Okay.
Okay.
No pressure.
All you viewers, donate all your money right now to Lion Recovery Fund. My final question: what can kids do to help?
I mean, there's a few things you can do. So, I mean, obviously, fundraising is something. Visiting Africa is, getting your parents to take you to Africa to visit the parks and reserves. I think is useful. And then I think more generally for maybe for conservation in general, maybe not so specific to lions, is trying to be careful with your lifestyle. So maybe eating more plant-based food, trying to cut down on just consumption for the sake of consumption, and supporting conservation efforts wherever they may occur.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks for watching. You can help animals by hitting the like button and subscribing to this channel. See you next time on Nature's Guardians.